Children have fears and worries. And so, I mean, obviously we know that young children can have irrational fears. They can worry about monsters and, you know, they can really be affected by images that they see. I'm working with a family right now whose 6-year-old boy is playing some sort of a game where there's like the Walking Dead type of game, and there's zombies. I don't know what that game might be, but there's a bunch of zombies, and he's having these horrible nightmares, and he's having episodes where he's just having really gory dreams, and he's having a hard time coping with the images that he's seeing, but he refuses to stop playing these games. And so sometimes for kids, they go through this phase where they're very fearful. They don't want to let you out of their sight, or you know, they see something that scares them, and basically it's that piece of development where they're having to learn to self-comfort, and we need to support them in as many ways as we can. What we don't want to do is ridicule them or shame them for having those fears. But for the most part, when it comes to zombies and monsters and things under the bed, we can give them some reassurance. We can say things like, if I believed in monsters, I would feel scared too. I can assure you there are no monsters, and that kind of thing. I'm sure you've got a lot of stories about how you deal with the monsters. It's one thing to reassure kids when they have irrational fears. It's another thing to reassure kids when they start having realistic fears. And at some point, kids start to realize that there are real dangers in the world. Probably now more than ever, they're hearing about real dangers. There's a lot of news these days about the dangers of the world. And how do we help our kids cope? Because we can only reassure them so much. And so the biggest thing is that for all of us, I mean, I grew up in Victoria. I've heard about the big earthquake coming my whole life, my entire life. If I worried about it my entire life, I wouldn't be standing here right now. So what do we typically do when it comes to experiencing realistic fears? What do? We prepare and forget. Yeah. And to let our kids know that we do everything we can to keep ourselves safe, and we prepare can be reassuring, but also to reassure things that these kind of things happen very infrequently, and it's highly unlikely that many of these things will happen. Because for kids, when they're hearing about this, they're thinking that it's happening all the time. They don't have a realistic perspective of the threat. It's heightened in a child's mind, if that makes sense. And so some things we just really need to protect kids from, a lot of the media coverage and that kind of thing. But the biggest piece, when I really looked into how to support our kids as we go through any kind of a crisis, the biggest piece is we need to be a role model of comfort to them. So kids pick up on our fears very quickly. And, so they're always looking to us for that kind of reassurance and how we're behaving, and to watch that we're not using catastrophic words, and that we're able to show a level of calmness. And the biggest thing, when I look back at that day, it was so surreal. But the biggest piece for everybody was to get back to a routine of pulling the weeds and doing what you do on a daily basis. Bring the routine back into life. So we can stress that accidents happen very rarely. And this is important information for a child. We can explain that death is a natural process that usually happens in older age and rarely happens to a young person. Without lying to a child, we can nevertheless let him know how rarely these things happen to anyone like him. We can also stress the fact that safety precautions make these things less likely to happen, and this will help a child feel some sense of control. Never, ever lie to a child, because they need to trust you. And when you're, often I'll get calls from parents wanting to know how to break news about a separation, or, if someone is ill in the family. And how I respond is to use the phrase that we've used in this course: always meet children where they're at. Give them basic facts without coloring the facts, but don't give them too much detail. Let the children guide you in terms of where they're at developmentally, and how much detail they're actually ready for. Children will usually guide you to their readiness point. But the important thing to stress is not to lie or sugarcoat, because if you do that, kids won't trust you. It's kind of like when they go to get a shot, for example. If you say something like, oh, it's not going to hurt, and it does hurt, it's like, okay, now how do I trust you with something else? Yeah. And I also like the idea of this may hurt you, but it won't harm you. Whereas not experiencing the hurt could harm you, if you believe in inoculations and things like that.